Hi, I'm Selena from Annie's Bookstop of Worcester, and I'm here with Cory Doctorow, who is a science fiction and a nonfiction author. He's an activist and a journalist, and he has written a number of new books, two really new books, as a matter of fact. And Cory, I'm going to let you tell people what they're about.
Sure. Well, my last novel was a book called The Bezel. It's the second book in the adventures of a guy called Marty Hench, who's a two-fisted forensic accountant who has been in Silicon Valley for 40 years, unwinding all the weirdest scams of the tech sector. And the series skips around in time. The first book in the series is called Red Team Blues, and it's actually his final adventure. He gets called out of retirement for one last job. In this one, it's set in the early 2000s, and it goes up to just the start of the Trump years, and it's really concerns itself with the prison tech industry. So all across America, prisons are getting rid of their libraries, their visitation rooms, their postal delivery, package delivery, continuing education, and all the other services, and replacing them with tablets. And the tablets are sometimes free. Sometimes the prisoners have to work to get them. The average prison wage in America is 53 cents an hour. Six states don't allow prisoners to make any money, and in North Carolina, it's capped at $1 a day. And once the prisoner has the tablet, all of their phone calls, all of their video visitations, all of their library access, all of their music, and so on takes place through this tablet, and it costs 5 or 6 times more than you or I will pay on the outside for these same services. $15 for a Project Gutenberg public domain ebook. And then to make things worse, as these companies have done these private equity roll-ups, and so they've merged and merged and merged, they will sometimes decide that they don't want to support the old IT infrastructure, and they'll just delete everything. So that hand-drawn birthday card your kid made for you that you paid $5 to have scanned and forwarded on to you because you cannot get physical mail, that's just gone, and you've got 10 more years on your sentence. And so in this book, Marty Hench decides to take on the prison tech sector. A friend of his ends up in jail as part of California's three strikes rule, which saw lots of people go to jail for 25 years or longer, to the point where the Supreme Court actually said just being in prison in California was itself cruel and unusual punishment because the prisons had become so crowded. And they plan an inside-outside heist where they take down one of these prison tech companies. Very satisfying revenge story. The other book that came out recently is the Internet Con. It's a nonfiction book from Verso, and it lays out a thesis about how the internet got as bad as it did, how it is that companies have become so malfeasant, how the products that we love have gotten so bad. The short explanation is we're no longer allowed to change our technology. And so if they do something bad, like update the printer so that it no longer takes third-party ink, you can't undo it. You can't install software that remakes it. And restoring that property, that interoperability that allows computers to be reconfigured by their owners using third-party products, would go a long way to disciplining these companies. And so it lays out the history of how we got here to this point where using a computer that you own in a way that the manufacturer doesn't like is actually a crime. My friend Jay Freeman calls it felony contempt of business model. They've rigged IP laws so that a lot of the things you do with your own computer are illegal,
And this
and
is
how to change it.
nonfiction.
And this is nonfiction. Yeah. This is really my life's work. I have, for nearly a quarter of a century, worked with the leading digital human rights organization in the world, the Electronic Frontier Foundation. And I've been involved with them in various capacities. I was their European director and so on. But these days I work on antitrust and competition. And this is an issue that I've been campaigning on for a long time. And it's one in which we're seeing enormous movement. The US, Europe, Canada, the UK, Australia, South Korea, Japan, even China are doing more on competition and antitrust than we've seen in 40 years. As we record this, the Department of Justice has just convicted Google of being a monopolist. And one of the things that might happen as a result is Google getting broken up like we did to the phone company in the 80s.
Wow, fantastic. Okay. So, and you've also just released a third book too.
Sure,
Um,
yeah. There's another book called The Lost Cause.
yeah,
Is that what you're thinking of? Yeah.
yes, that's what I'm
So
thinking.
So the reason for the confusion here is that I write when I'm anxious. So during lockdown, I wrote 9 books. And so
Oh,
they're all coming out one after another. Excuse me. And so I can't keep them straight. I actually just signed a contract for 2 more books, and
wow.
I was going through the publisher's questionnaire. It's a new publisher for me, going through their questionnaire about what other books I've published and how, what publicities work for me well and so on. And they asked for a list of all the books I've published, and I went through it and I was like, wait a second, I've published 35 books, and it turns out it's 35. My first book came out 24 years ago, so it's more than a book a year. So I am both proud and mystified by how much I've written. So the Lost Cause is a solar punk novel. It's a climate emergency novel about people really coming to grips with the climate emergency, really doing something to make things better. It's set here in the town I live in, Burbank, which is a funny little town on the outskirts of Los Angeles. We're right by the town line here that separates us from Hollywood. In the same way that like Sarah Palin could see Russia from her front porch. I can go out on my lawn and see the Warner Brothers Tower and the city line with Los Angeles. And in The Lost Cause, we find ourselves in an America that's finally taking the climate emergency seriously and doing something about it. They're solarizing, they're weatherizing, they are dealing with the mass migration of climate refugees, domestic ones within the US and ones all over the world. They are addressing a true energy transition and climate justice. And it's going great. Like for the first time, in 100 years, you have a generation that isn't afraid of the future, that really feels that no matter what's coming, they'll figure it out. And that's when the backlash starts. After 3 terms of transformative presidential administrations, a hard right, billionaire friendly new administration comes in with the goal of unwinding everything that has happened. Far right militias are mobilized across the country, and seafaring billionaires who took to the sea in a big flotilla after they were told that they would have to pay taxes in America show up at the port of Long Beach. And the protagonist is a young guy named Brooks, who's just graduating from Burroughs High down the road here. And in the period of just a few days, the future that he thinks he's going to have disappears, and he finds himself caught up in a much different kind of future.
So, those 3 books that you've just talked about, can you choose one of them that you want to talk about most?
Gosh. Well, I guess The Bezel, the second Marty Hench book, because I've just finished all the edits on the third one. So
Okay.
the third one is set in the early 1980s. It's Marty's first adventure. And it's set in San Francisco during the heroic and weird era of the PC when everyone was making PCs and each one was stranger than the last. And his first job is working for a company run by a Mormon bishop, a Catholic priest, and an Orthodox rabbi that sells within faith groups. And it turns out that they're using affinity scams to do multi-level sales. And 3 of the women who lead the sales teams have figured it out, and they've left to start a rival company. And Marty is charged with destroying their company. And he decides that he's actually working for the bad guys, and he changes sides. And so he goes to work for these 3 women. One is an Orthodox woman who's been kicked out of her family when she came out as a lesbian. One's a Mormon woman who's repudiated the church because of its opposition to the Equal Rights Amendment. And one is a nun who's gotten involved with Marxist liberation theology in Central America during the Dirty Wars. And they start a different kind of weird PC company.
Uh-huh. Okay. So, how did you come up with the character of Marty Hench?
It was a funny thing. So as I say, I wrote 9 books during lockdown. And one of them was this book, Red Team Blues. And my idea was that it would be really fun to write the final book in a beloved long running series without doing the tedious work of writing the beloved long running series, right? To have that kind of last night of summer camp energy that you get when you watch like the MASH finale. And imagine how great it would be to have a sitcom that was just every week the final episode of a sitcom that never existed, but is treated as though it's had like, 10 successful seasons, right? And so I thought it'd be really fun to write this kind of mise en scène, where Marty is like assuming that you know who he is because you've been following his adventures for 15 years, except it's the first book in the series. So I wrote this book and it came out in kind of a white heat. It was about 6 weeks from the day I started to the day I finished. And I knew I really had something when two of the most important people in my life read it really quickly and liked it. So my wife is a wonderful person with a very busy life. She works for one of the studios as a technology executive, and she cannot read all the things I write. I write too fast for her. And so I, wrote this book and I emailed her the manuscript and I said, look, I know you probably don't have time to read this whole thing, but I wrote it so fast, I can't tell if it's any good. Just read a couple of pages and let me know what you think. And I rolled over in bed. It was 2:30 in the morning and she had her phone on. And I was like, what the hell are you doing? She said, well, I just had to find out how it ended. So I knew something good was happening at that moment. And then I sent it to my editor. And my editor is a great guy called Patrick Nielsen Hayden. I've known him since I was 17 years
Yeah.
old. We met on a bulletin board system called Genie in the 1980s. He contributed to my scholarship fund for the Clarion Writers Workshop when I went away when I was 21. I used to read slush for him, read unsolicited manuscripts for him when I went to New York. Torontonians notoriously love New York. It takes two Torontonians to change a light bulb, one to change it and one to go to New York and make sure light bulbs are still cool. And so I really love him, and he's edited every one of my novels. And I don't think he will be offended in the least if I say to you, he's not the world's greatest email correspondent. And so when I sent him the manuscript, I thought, okay, this is going to be like a couple of months before I hear back from him. And instead, the next morning, I get this email from him. It's just 3 lines. That was a fucking ride. Whoa. And he called my agent and he bought three of them. And I was on the horns of a dilemma because this was Marty Hench's last adventure. And I could have brought him out of retirement, except I kind of gotten to like the guy and I felt like he'd earned his rest. There is some precedent here. Sherlock Holmes goes over Rickenbach Falls because Arthur Conan Doyle is sick of him. And then Queen Victoria says, I'll give you a knighthood if you bring him back. So he brings him back over Rickenbach Falls for another couple of books. And, Patrick, he's a very powerful man in New York publishing, uh, senior editor at the Macmillan Corporation, but he can't knight me. And so I wasn't going to bring Marty back out of retirement. And so I kind of moped about it for a while, trying to figure out what to do to make these three books work. And I realized there's no reason I have to tell these stories in order. And in fact, apart from the certainty if you're reading a prequel or a book that comes chronologically earlier, not really a prequel in that sense, but a book that is chronologically earlier than a book you've already read, that you can be pretty damn sure that the character isn't going to die. Everything else is up for grabs in that book. So the amount of dramatic tension really doesn't go down. And in the meantime, you can throw as much detail in as you want, and you never have to worry about continuity because you're going backwards. You're not foreshadowing, you're backshadowing. And the more of the stuff you put in, the more of a premeditated motherfucker you seem to be, even if you're just making it up as you go along. And so my agent, my editor, and I agreed I was going to do these books out of order, and it's been really successful. The books have done really well. Both were national bestsellers, the first two. I've got high hopes for Picks and Shovels that comes out next February. And I love the character. I love the milieu. I love writing these stories. And I really love the audio editions. So I keep my audio rights and I produce my own audiobooks. And I use Will Wheaton to read these books. And Will's an old pal of mine, a neighbor of mine here in Burbank. And he's such a good reader and he really gets my stuff. And boy, did he knock it out of the park with these two.
Oh, fantastic. So when you actually first wrote the story, did you realize it was going to be a series, or did you think
No,
it was
no,
just going to
no.
be a one-off?
Yeah, no, it was a one-off. No, no, no. When my editor bought three, I was in trouble. Right. Remember, I then had to figure out how to add two more books to the
Right.
series. And I don't think it'll stop at three. I've got at least two more on the drawing board now. But three was the initial buy.
Great. So what was actually the inspiration for the story, for your first story?
You know, I've spent more than 20 years working on tech policy, and I have seen all the weird things that tech people do and all the great things that tech people do. Sometimes it's hard to tell which is which, but the nonprofit that I work for, the Electronic Frontier Foundation, one of our founders is a guy called Mitchell Kapor. And Mitch is famous for many things, but most of all, he invented a software package called Lotus 123. And Lotus 123 was the second spreadsheet after VisiCalc, and it was the first runaway success spreadsheet. And to hear Mitch tell of it, a lot of the finance crime of the 80s and 90s is a direct result of the spreadsheet. That like you couldn't do junk bonds unless you had a spreadsheet, right? You couldn't like there are a
Yeah.
lot of people who figured out how to make money disappear into those little boxes. And I thought, there's no reason that everyone who fell in love with the spreadsheet had to dedicate their lives to making the money disappear. Someone out there must have figured out how to make the money reappear. And the Red Team Blues is a cryptocurrency heist. So if you want to talk about weird, terrible things that the tech sector has done, cryptocurrency is right up there at the top. This giant Ponzi scheme that, incinerated hundreds of billions of normal people's money to make a small number of people very rich. And I felt like cryptocurrency was kind of the apotheosis of all the worst parts of how people thought about technology. That idea that spreadsheets and other automation tools were a way to just screw normies. And that was, I think, the impetus to come up with this great forensic accountant and turn him loose on the cryptocurrency bros.
Okay. So what kind of research did you have to do in order to write the book?
Well, here's the thing. I've been a blogger for more than 20 years, as long as I've been working at the Electronic Frontier Foundation. So for 19 years, I was one of the owners of a website called Boing Boing. I still co-own it, but I also used to write on it every day, 5, 10 posts a day. I wrote about 60,000 posts for Boing Boing. And since then, I've had this solo project, pluralistic.net, and I publish on that nearly every day. And the method here is that whenever something comes along that seems important, rather than like grabbing a, little notebook like this and scribbling notes to myself, um, I turn it into a blog post. I write it up for consumption by strangers, and I try to crystallize whatever it is that caught my attention about it, why it seemed important. And that act is very clarifying, right? It forces me to have some rigor. I don't know about you, but the notes that I leave to myself in notebooks, not only can I not make out my handwriting, but when I do, I don't know what I meant, right? I take so many shortcuts, but you can't do that when you're writing for the public. And so what I've ended up with is this giant database, both like a literal database, so 60,000 blog posts and a WordPress installation that I can access at will, but also a figurative database, right? This kind of super saturated stew of fragmentary story ideas that have been mnemonically lodged in my mind by the act of taking these notes on it. And that stew, it's just kind of all the little bits are floating around in there. And every now and again, a couple of them will like glom together, nucleate, and crystallize into like a story or a novel or whatever. And so for the most part, I don't do research when I start writing a book. I do research and then I figure out what book I'm writing. I'm always doing research.
Okay.
And so, this is how I wrote 9 books during lockdown, is that I'd already done the research without knowing what book I was writing.
Interesting. That's a great way to do that.
Mhm.
Wow. Okay. So what was the biggest challenge that you had in writing and putting out the bezel?
Um, it's indecent to say, but this was an easy book to write. Uh, you know, I work with a great team. I have my agent, my publicists. I have independent publicists as well as the publicity team at Tor. I have I'm lucky enough that I get asked to go out and speak at a lot of big events. And so in addition to the tour, I was able to do a lot of other events and then piggyback parts of the tour on it, both in Europe and in the US. And I'm good at this, right? I've done this for so long. If there's a thing that's hard, it's like balancing out everything else. Everything I do now does double and triple duty. So, blogging isn't just a way to organize my ideas, it's also a way to get them out there, to do advocacy, to promote my work and so on. And so when I'm out on the road with a book, I can't stop blogging because that's how I'm selling the book and also doing advocacy for EFF and also organizing my thoughts for the next book and so on. And so I've got to keep doing it. Um, the work I do at the Electronic Frontier Foundation is very related to the fiction I write. The fiction that I write is very related to my nonfiction. And then on top of that, all that, there's my family and being a father and so on. And so it's very hard to just stop doing something. I feel like I've got this Jenga tower that is my life, and I've taken out all the blocks that move, right? And all that's left are blocks that are load bearing. And so when something new comes along, it's just hard, right? It's like everything else gets squeezed. And it's the choice to give something up is the choice to abandon not just one thing, but a thing that's contributing to all the parts of my life that matter.
Hmm. So, what was the hardest book that you had to write?
Well, it's probably the collaborations in as much as in a collaboration, both writers do 75% of the work. And so I've written two books with marvelous collaborators. I wrote a novel called Rapture of the Nerds with Charlie Strauss, and I wrote a book during lockdown called Choke Point Capitalism with my friend Rebecca Giblin in Australia. And it was delightful to work with both of them. Honestly, they're both terrific, but it's hard, right? Because writing's a very solitary activity. It's hard
Yeah.
to like argue with other people. But I'm very happy with how both of those books turned out. I wrote a book called Someone Comes to Town, Someone Leaves Town. That's probably the rockiest story of how a book got written. So I was living in San Francisco in my 20s, and my parents came out for a visit, and we went to, or no, maybe I was in my 30s. I guess it was in my early 30s, and we went out to Napa to wine country, and we stayed in a B&B. And as we were like pulling up, and I was checking into my room, I had this idea for like the opening of a novel. And I sat down and I just like pounded out like 10,000 words in that room. And then I kind of petered out and I just left it on my hard drive. And then 3 years later, I was working on another book that got stuck and I didn't know what to do. And I was just sort of flipping through my hard drive and I found that 10,000 words. And so I started writing that instead. And normally when I'm writing, I'll set a number of pages that I want to do every day. So I think in that case, it was a page a day. Page a day is a good pace. That's a novel every year. And I was doing my page a day. It's a longish book. I got within spitting distance of the end, so probably 80% of the way through. And I'd been working up to this ending, and I realized that it was not the ending I wanted to write. That like I just didn't, I lost confidence in the ending. So I kind of moped and walked around for a few weeks trying to think of a good ending. And I thought of an ending, and I wrote the ending and I printed out the whole book. And I was like, okay, now I'm gonna have to rewrite the whole book
Mhm.
because I've just stuck a new ending on that is not foreshadowed anywhere in the book, is not the ending I was writing towards. So I print out the whole book. I turn the manuscript over after pulling it out of the printer tray. I start rereading it. And in the first page that I wrote in that B&B in Napa at this point, 5 years before, I had foreshadowed the ending I was just writing. And I didn't know it, right? Like it took me 5 years to find out what was in my own head. So that was really exciting. And the other weird thing about that book, I finished it while speaking at a conference in Arizona. And so again, I was like nearly done with this book. I knew I only had like 2 or 3 pages left. So there had been a dinner and there had been a great after dinner speaker. It was actually Neil Stevenson was the after dinner speaker. It was really cool. And then I went back to my room and I was like, all right, I'm going to see if I can finish this tonight. So I start writing and I'm so tired, like so tired. and I'm writing and I'm sleepy and I'm writing and I'm sleepy and then I fell asleep while typing after I finished the book. And after I finished the book, I typed two more nonsense sentences in my sleep. And I like my chin hit my chest and I looked up and I was like, and I looked at my screen. I was like, what is that nonsense? And I deleted it. I wish I hadn't. I wish I knew what those two sentences were. But I had literally written part of that book in my sleep.
Oh, wow. That would have been great to have it.
Yeah,
So, when you write, do you outline your books or are you a pantser?
much more of a pantser. I'm not
It sounds like.
entirely. I do a lot of both. I often have big structural ideas about how the book is going to work. I have set pieces that I want to write towards, but not that kind of intricate war room stuff that I've seen other writers do. I don't know how they do it. It's not how I think about this.
Okay. Um, all right. So, what else can we expect from you in the near future? I know you just
Well,
said there was another Martin
yeah,
Hench book.
I've just sold. Well, there's this other Martin Hench book, Picks and Shovels. There's going to be a Little Brother short story collection.
Oh,
There is a graphic novel based on my novella Unauthorized Bread. It's a middle grades graphic novel from first second. And there is a collection of columns. There is a book about enshittification, and there is a graphic novel about enshittification, all coming out. And enshittification is this word I came up with to describe how platforms go bad. So all
great.
of those things are in the next couple 3 years. Uh, and then I'm not sure. I said these other Martin Hench books on my drawing board. Might write some more short fiction. I don't know. Hard to say. My kid graduates in a year, so we're gonna have a lot more spare time and fewer responsibilities around the house.
Wow, that's
I hope.
great.
Yeah,
You think.
maybe.
Okay. I have questions for you about being a writer. Right?
Sure.
What is your favorite part about being a writer on the whole writing and publishing process?
Oh, it's got to be having written. Having written is so much better than writing.
Yep.
It's great to be done.
Okay. Yep. I would agree with that. Yep. Okay. So what has been your favorite adventure during your writing career?
Adventure. I don't know that I had a lot of adventures during my writing career. I've had a lot of adventures in my career as an activist. I was a UN representative and
Oh,
worked in standards bodies, and I was the European director of the EFF and went to 31 countries in 3 years and
oof.
saw and did a lot of things. But and I guess that's writing adjacent. I got to meet a lot of people who were really important to me and are really important to me. I got to become friends with some of my idols, uh, and that was very nice. Um, I guess, yeah. Excuse me, I'm going to sneeze 1 second here. Sorry about that. Um, yeah, I don't know. Well, here was a weird thing. I went to Singapore for the Writers' Festival in 2006, and I had a bureaucrat from Singapore approach me from the Culture Ministry, and he showed me his 5-year plan to train a Nobel Prize winning novelist. And so they were analyzing all the things that novelists had written about and that had won Nobel Prizes, what their background was like, and so on. And he asked me what I thought of it, and I was like, if you want to have an art scene, you don't need to do all of this. You just need to stop making homosexuality illegal. And then like 90% of the problems with your arts scene will just sort themselves out. And I think at this point, homosexuality is tolerated, if not legal, in Singapore. So,
Oh, okay. So what is the greatest lesson that you've learned thus far in your writing career?
um, well, it's a good question. I suck at these greatest and worst and best and top and Like I always feel like, well, was that really the best? Was that really the most important
It's a
lesson? Was there
good.
another one?
What's
Yeah.
one of the lessons that you've learned?
Yeah. I I guess a lesson that I've learned is that young people, because I write young adult books as well, young people, when they tell you they don't like your books, it's because they're taking them seriously. So my friend Steve Bruce, he says telling someone they wrote a bad book is like telling them they've got an ugly kid. Even if it's true, they did everything they could to prevent it, and it's too late now. But when a kid comes up and tells me what they didn't like about my book, it took me a while to figure this out, but it's because they're taking it seriously as a way of unpacking the world. And they want to argue with you about your book because it doesn't line up with their experience of the world, and they are trying to make sense of the world. And so there is a solemn and real responsibility that you have as a YA writer that materializes in that moment.
Interesting thought. Huh. Okay. Um, so when you're writing for YA, well, you write science fiction, but you also write you write nonfiction. Do you write nonfiction for young adult writer for young adults or
Not really. I do pedagogical talks for young adults, but I don't really write nonfiction for young adults.
okay, interesting. All right. So what piece of advice would you want to share? Another piece of advice would you want to share for other writers?
Well, the single best piece of advice that I got and didn't listen to for far too long was to write every day. I always assumed that write every day was an aspirational goal, like eating 5 helpings of vegetables and doing an hour of aerobic exercise, something you would do if you had a chef and a trainer, but that like is not really a thing that anyone does. And the reality is that if you write every day, it becomes a habit, and that habits are things you get for free. And for a long time, when I started writing, I would write when I was inspired because it wasn't my job. I was just a kid enjoying making up stories. And I got a lot of positive feedback. My friends told me I was a good writer. My parents were, happy to see me writing and so on. And so it was easy to do, and it didn't matter if I didn't want to do it on a given day because it wasn't my job. And then it became my job, or the thing that I wanted to be my job. And I had to figure out how to write when I wasn't inspired. And after many years of really sweating that, I came to this realization that although there were days when the writing seemed to be really good and days when the writing seemed to be just terrible, and although when I was done and I went back and reread the books, there were parts of them that were really good and parts that I needed to tear out and rewrite, that these were not correlated in any way. The biggest predictor of whether I was going to was feeling good about the writing I was doing or feeling bad was like what was going on in my life, right? It was a kind of emotional incontinence. If I was fighting with my girlfriend or getting my ass kicked at the United Nations, or if I was hungover or jet lagged or sick or hungry, then it felt like my writing was terrible. And I gradually gained the ability to not to stop feeling like the writing was terrible, but to write even on days when it felt like the writing was terrible, right? To write and then put it away and go back, find the terrible things and fix them later. And there's this joke my wife and I share, and she knows when I'm having a bad day when I reference it. So there's a joke about a guy who goes to Pamplona to see the running of the bulls. And at lunch, he goes into a little bistro, and there's a guy at the next table eating this huge plate of stew and big, big, weird cut of meat in the middle of it. And he asks the waiter, "What's that guy eating?" And he says, "That, sir, is the most special meal in Pamplona. It's the testicles of the bull that lost the bullfight, and the bull that was killed in the fighting ring today." So the guy comes back the next day and he says, "I'll have what that guy yesterday was having." And the waiter comes out with a plate with a very tiny stew with a very tiny odd cut of meat in it. He says, waiter, what is this? And the waiter says, I'm sorry, senor. Sometimes the bull wins. And when I come into the house, because I mostly write in the hammock in the backyard, when I come into the house and my wife asks me how things are going, and I say, sometimes the bull wins, she knows that it's one of those days.
That's great. Okay. I love it. Okay. So my next question,
Mhm.
I can't top that at all. Um, are there any groups, clubs, or organizations you'd recommend to other writers that may have helped you in your career?
So peer workshops were really important to my development as a writer. So this is where you and other writers who are writing about the same level get together and critique one another's manuscripts. So you circulate the manuscript in advance, you read it closely at least twice, you mark up the manuscript with notes. Each person speaks in turn. No one is allowed to interrupt. And at the end, the writer speaks. And the goal is to figure out how to make the piece better, but it really makes you better at your own work, really makes you better at understanding your own work. I also attended the Clarion Science Fiction Writing Workshop, which is a workshop that's very similar to that format, although there's also an instructor who speaks last. It lasts for 6 weeks. It's currently domiciled at the University of California at San Diego. I'm on the board of Clarion now. It's organized as a nonprofit foundation. And I've taught Clarion and graduated from Clarion. And I think very highly of that method if you have 6 weeks and the money to spend for it. I also am at great pains to say, you can always uh, become a writer without giving up 6 weeks of your life and thousands of dollars to Clarion. But if you can do it, it's well worth doing.
Mhm. Now, do you have to be chosen for that, or
That's right. It's a highly selective workshop, so you have to submit at least two manuscripts and so on. But it's if you get in, there's a lot of opportunity.
okay? Now I have questions about you as a person. What is one thing that most people don't realize about you?
Well, I don't talk a lot about my family in my professional life. I spend a lot of time talking about policy and talking about politics and talking about weird aesthetics and you talking about Disney theme parks. I was an Imagineer for a while. I've got lots of theories and ideas about them. But I don't talk about my family very much. I do an annual brief podcast with my daughter. But my family's really very central to my life, as well as my extended family. And they're just, if you're not a friend of mine, if you're just a fan of mine, you won't know much about them.
Okay. So tell us a little bit more about your family.
Ah, Well, so my wife is a badass. She was the first woman to play Quake for England. She was the first internationally ranked woman esports player. She ran video game practice for the BBC and Channel 4, won some BAFTA awards, sold a startup to Disney, went to work to run a lab at Disney called Studio Lab, been nominated for a couple of Emmys, and does really amazing high-tech storytelling stuff that she's not allowed to talk about and that I don't know half of. And my
Uh,
kid is a 16-year-old who loves dance, hip hop dance and is going away to university next year and not sure what she wants to do.
oh, fantastic. Does she know what university she's going to?
Not
Not
yet,
yet.
but we'll figure that out.
Wonderful. That's great. Okay. What question do you wish interviewers would ask you? And what would your answer be?
Uh, I have I have so many different public lives between the activism and the writing and whatnot that I get asked a really wide variety of questions. Um, and because I'm a blogger, everything that seems important to me. I've written about it some time or another. And so I have like very complicated thoughts about how to make a great cup of coffee, for example. And I've written about it very extensively, and I have been interviewed about it and so on. So I guess I'm quite blessed in as much as like I really do get asked all the questions.
Okay, wow. Yeah, you've been interviewed a lot, I guess.
Oh, an awful lot. You know, part of my job at EFF is to drum up public interest in the issues that we work on. And so I talk to the press a ton about EFF issues.
So what kind of issues do you work on?
Well, these days, mostly I'm working on antitrust and competition. So, you know, Google has
Okay.
been declared an illegal monopolist. There are all of these antitrust actions happening in Europe. There's stuff changing in Canada. We're getting revisions to the antitrust law there. And, you know, sort of chasing big tech to the ends of the earth and trying to smash its power. Uh, in public forums, in standards bodies, in the expert agencies, in legislatures, in treaties. I also get sucked by my colleagues into some international and treaty work because I did that for so long for EFF. So one thing I'm quite concerned about right now is there is a UN treaty whose negotiations are being concluded now on cybercrime, which is not
Mhm.
necessarily a terrible idea. I'm okay with you know, having international conventions for cooperation to like catch ransomware creeps or people doing child sex abuse material or whatever. The problem is that this is an extraordinarily badly drafted treaty. So it doesn't define what cybercrime is. Each member state gets to define cybercrime for itself. And so in the world's autocracies, cybercrime is anything the government doesn't like that you do with a computer. So if you criticize the government with a computer, that is cybercrime. If you are gay and you use a computer to talk about it, that is cybercrime. And so it doesn't define cybercrime, but it does create an obligation on all the signing parties to help one another fight cybercrime. So you could get China demanding that France order one of its tech companies to turn over the private messages of a user who committed a cybercrime, where that cybercrime was criticizing the government.
Mhm.
And turning that over could then expose that user to extrajudicial detention, torture, you know, killing, whatever, reprisals. And Moreover, the treaty provides for indefinite gag orders. And so the Chinese government could impose an obligation on the French government to order a French company to turn over information about one of its users and then never disclose that fact. And so we won't even know how it's being used, right? And so, you know, the treaty doesn't prohibit member states from adding more safeguards in, but it doesn't require them to do it either. And so oftentimes in a treaty, the important stuff is in the difference between must and may. And so parts of the treaty that say may, you can safely ignore.
Mhm.
You really want to pay attention to the stuff that says must. And all the human rights safeguards in the UN Cybercrime Treaty are may. And all the stuff that is liable for abuse is a must. And so I'm quite worried about it. It seems like maybe the US Trade Representative's posture on this is changing. The Biden administration has signaled that it might uh, back out of the treaty or demand changes to it. So for most of the treaty's negotiations, the Biden administration and before them, the Trump administration have actually been a driving force for all the worst parts of the treaty. So it's nice to see that the US is realizing that it's been on the wrong side of history here. I hope it's not too late. And I hope they follow through.
Wow. Hope so. Wow. Okay. On to other things, what is or are your passions when you're not writing? And how do you make time for all the things that you love?
So I don't. I'm a workaholic. Uh,
Why
you
did
know,
I
we
figure that?
we built a very elaborate tiki bar in our backyard during lockdown. Like it's as big as my old apartment. It's basically an ADU for booze. It's quite exciting, and it's the third tiki bar I've owned, and the best one so far. And so there's that. I have a booze hobby, or at least a bar hobby. Um, I'm a very avid swimmer. We actually live across the street from an Olympic public pool with, uh, you know, year-round outdoor heated lanes, and I swim every day. Uh, what else? All my other hobbies are just like now part of my job, right? Like I
Yep.
go to the Pasadena flea market when I can, but I write about it, like
Yeah.
there's not, I don't have a lot of hobby. Like I love cooking, and cooking plays a really big role in all of my novels. So, there's not really any hobby that isn't this is getting back to all the loose Jenga blocks have been removed, and all that's left are load bearing Jenga blocks.
Mm, that's interesting. Sometimes I go back to something that Jane Yolen used to say, has said. Is, she said you can find a story in anything. You know?
Sure.
And
That's definitely true.
yeah, and that sounds like exactly what you're saying.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, you can find a story in anything, and also everything can become part of your writing practice. That's the corollary of that.
Right, exactly. So what does your writing space look like? Is that your writing space that
Yeah,
you're
this is my office. I actually confess I don't do a lot of writing in here anymore. I sit in the hammock in the backyard, under the eaves, and I write. That's like I get up at 5 in the morning. I go out there. I turn on. We have these mosquito vapes that because we have invasive mosquitoes in Southern California now, ankle biters. So I turn on the mosquito vapes, and then I come back in and I make coffee, feed the cats, put the laundry on, and then I go out in the hammock and I work for about an hour. I make my wife coffee and wake her up, say goodbye to my kid, who at that point is ready to go to school, and put the laundry in the dryer and do some physiotherapy, and then go back out to the hammock for another hour, then get showered and changed and start the day. And to the extent that I can, I do my meetings in the hammock too. When I'm recording like now, I can't, but most of the time I'm out in the hammock. My
uh,
my colleagues have gotten used to it at work. They are familiar with me being in the hammock while we're on Zoom calls. The only rule is I'm not allowed to swing it back and forth because it nauseates them.
good things? You also answered a couple of my other questions, one of which is that writers very often have furry or feathered or otherwise non-human companions. And
Yeah.
do they help you or hinder you with your work?
The cats are my wife's cats. They are not my cats. I am the person who feeds them. But they've
Your wife's
made it
cats.
very clear whose cats they are.
I see. But you feed them.
I feed them. I feed them when there's no one else around to pet them. They will demand that I pet them. But they would be quite happy to eat my eyeballs if I died. That's very clear. They're not going to miss me in the slightest. When I go traveling, I travel a lot for work. When I go traveling, they are not put out in the slightest. When my wife goes traveling, they are miserable.
Oh. But do they hinder you while you're trying to work?
Well, they are indoor cats who would like to be outdoor cats. And so every time I get out of the hammock and go into the house or vice versa, they try to run between my feet and sometimes manage it. It's very hard, particularly to like carry a cup of coffee out and do the sliding doors without letting the cats out.
I know that feeling.
Yeah,
Yes. Okay. Now I have just two more questions for you.
sure.
One is, where can people find your work aside from Annie's Bookstop of Worcester? And
Right.
although, people should definitely check here first. And you can get Corey's work if you call us at 508-796-5613, or you can email us at orders@anniesbooksworcester.com. But where else can people find your books?
Well, wherever books are sold, really. And if you'd like to get my ebooks, I have a unique, as far as I know, arrangement with all my publishers where they let me sell my ebooks. So
Ah,
rather than buying the ebooks from Kobo or Amazon or whatever, you can go to craphound.com/shop and you can buy the ebooks from me. And so you take the money you give me and I take 30% of it and I put that in my pocket. That's the retailer share. That's the share that Jeff Bezos would take if he sold you the ebook. And I send the 70% back to my publisher. And then they take 25% of that, which is my royalty, and they send it back to me. It's a very weird arrangement, but
it's
it works great. And the books don't have any digital rights management. You can play them on any player and use them in any software. And it's a way to directly support the artists you love.
excellent. That's a great That's great. Okay, and my last question is, how can we follow your work and share your awesomeness?
Pluralistic.net is my daily newsletter. It's available as a website, an RSS feed, mailing list. All of those are full text, Creative Commons licensed under the most generous terms. You can reproduce them, including commercially. You can resell it, provided you attribute it to me. And there's no tracking, no ads, no animations, no sound, none of the things people don't like. My privacy policy is I don't collect your data. And so it fits on one line. And you can also read it on other platforms. So I syndicate it to Twitter, to Mastodon, and to Tumblr, and to Medium. And you can also listen to me reading aloud selected aspects of the newsletter, selected editions of the newsletter, and my weekly podcast. And those are all linked across the top at pluralistic.net.
How do you spell that? Pluralistic?
Pluralistic, Pluralistic, pluralistic.net.
Okay. And you also have a web page?
Yeah, craphound.com is where you can get all my writerly info, but that's linked off pluralistic.net.
Okay, that's great. Well, thank you so much, Cory.
Oh,
It's
thank
been
you.
great, and I appreciate your talking to us.
My
And
pleasure. I hope to come into the store someday.
that would,
I love Massachusetts. So
oh yeah. Did you go to MIT by any
I'm a
chance?
research affiliate at the Media Lab,
Ah,
and
okay, that's
I'm
what I
speaking at
had picked.
Boston Public Library on September 24th as well.
Are you really?
Yeah. Yeah, they're doing a
That's
panel on book banning, so I'm coming in for that.
oh, fantastic. You should definitely come and visit us.
I'm coming in that morning for my brother's wedding in Toronto, and I'm flying out the next morning to get home and have eye surgery. I had cataract operated on this eye, which is why there's no glass in this lens. This eye is now good, and I'm getting this eye, which does have glass in it, fixed next.
Oh, wow. Well, good luck with that then.
Yeah.
Well, thanks very much, and we really appreciate this.
All right. Well, thanks.
Yeah.